Hello and welcome to our Lakeside Chat. We are David Wofford and Katie Noonan, co-chairs of the Rotary Nature Center Friends. And we're so happy that you can join us tonight.
As we begin our program, it is important for us to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, that Lake Merritt is part of Ohlone territory. We hear now from Corinna Gould, spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn and co-founder of Segura Te Land Trust.
Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Corinna Gould. I am the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn. We are here today at what most folks think of as Lake Merritt. We are in the territory of Huichin. Huichin is actually a territory that encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Emeryville, Albany, and Piedmont. And this was a place of abundance. I'm so happy that people from all walks of life that now come into our territory can enjoy this beautiful place that my ancestors have enjoyed since the beginning of time. My relationship to the land that I have been born to, raising my children and grandchildren here, has been to tell the story, the truth of what happened on this land before other people came here. I'm hoping that as we begin to learn these lessons of fires in California, the pandemic that's happening, that human beings come back to living in reciprocity with the earth.
And so it's really special to have Corinna Gould introduce our programs every week. And we're going to be, because in the years that we have been doing our programs, she has accomplished so much in terms of educating the people of Oakland and people of the region about the history of the Ohlone in our area, and bringing forward efforts to make reparations really for the suffering of her people at the hands of colonial and white settlers over the past few hundred years. So in her intro, she does allude to the fact that that we are really out of reciprocity with the earth, an important theme in the culture of her people, and that she hopes that she can share some of that, and that we can receive some of that understanding that was so vital to them, and we need to think about that going into the future as well. So thank you, Corinna. So we're so happy that you can be here tonight to enjoy a wonderful talk about San Francisco Bay, and with one of the the person who knows the most about it, and who has studied the San Francisco Bay natural history from so many angles. We are so pleased to have Dr. Andrew Cohen. I am going to briefly share my screen here. Yes, I wanted to mention that we are going to be producing Rotary Nature Center Friends calendar again this year, and one of the pages will be celebrating one of our speakers, Corinna Gould, and showing a photo and having a link to her chat. I believe it was over a year ago, but still very ripping and an interesting talk. So I'm going to turn briefly to this slide. At this point in our program, we often talk about the highlights of the past month for Rotary Nature Center Friends. And this has been an extremely busy month for us, and I think very productive. We've been working with local adults and with local youth in both monitoring the plankton community of Lake Merritt and monitoring water quality. And so as a result of our work this year, or this month, we've been able to send samples to scientific labs to test the water, various kinds of microorganisms, algae, and so forth that might be of concern. And so far, glad to report that we have not actually they have not actually located any of the evidence that would require any posting of warnings to people who are visiting Lake Merritt. Also very important to notice that there has been no return of the harmful alga Heterosigma akashiwo that caused the big fish kill in 2022. In this month, we have advanced our youth programming and community science programs with weekly meetings with the Achieve scholars and also with other groups that have come to Lake Merritt to do water testing, learn a little bit about water quality at the lake, and take a look at the plankton that's there. It's part of the living lake ecosystem that we are lucky to be neighbors to. And then finally, I'd like to give a shout out to the group of people who are at Lake Merritt, frequently walking on their breaks, going there on the weekends, many with nice cameras and wonderful natural history skills that have been keeping an eye on the lake. We call this our Eyes on the Lake. And I'd like to especially thank Lila Arum, pictured here, in the fish jumping episode that we have had in the last month. Lila has been very interested because she feeds the rescue white pelican, Hank, and she was interested to observe how both the brown and the white pelicans reacted to these very numerous fish that we're pretty sure are top smelt, but not entirely sure that that's the only fish species that's available. One of the first hypotheses was that these fish were gulping for air because they would leap out of the water and be the surface making little ripples and so forth. And so we took a professional sonde out to test the water where the fish were jumping. And in many cases, the dissolved oxygen was well above the 5 parts per million, which is the target concentration of dissolved oxygen for water in the lake. So that opened up a whole array of other questions that people have about why are these fish jumping? What are they doing? What's going to happen to them? And so we're going to just stay tuned and find out, in fact, what is going to happen in the coming weeks and so forth. We've been taking many groups out ashore to test the water for themselves and also to gather plankton samples and look at them to get a sense of the amount of life that is there in Lake Merritt, doing just fine right now after the fish kill. We've also hosted tables at the lake to help people, where people are helping us actually, to document the species that are currently surviving in Lake Merritt after a really difficult year with the fish kill, where the dissolved oxygen went down to 0 in Lake Merritt, and thousands of fish died on the shoreline, to a very significant fresh period, which wiped out a lot of the life in the lake in the early winter. We had atmospheric rivers. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share. We are really so honored and thrilled to have with us tonight Dr. Andrew Cohen from the Center for Research on Aquatic Bioinvasions, or CRAB. He's also had such a long and wonderful career. I sent some of it out in a small bio, and I will send that out again. But he has been involved. He degrees in master's and PhD in energy and resources. He's involved in wastewater treatment, I do believe, and looking at nutrients in the bay. So has just an incredible career. Personally, I am really impressed by Andrew's generosity in reaching out to the common citizen, and especially to educators and to students. He came out to my classes at Oakland High School many, many times, and shared his enthusiasm for all the slimy and interesting little creatures that live at the shore of Lake Merritt. So I cannot possibly adequately introduce you, Andrew, but you said that you would be able to say a few more words to introduce yourself. And I would like to ask, are you ready now to take the floor to talk about the mystery oyster in San Francisco Bay?
Thank you, Katie. So Katie was kind enough to ask me back to give a talk after I failed to show up for a previously scheduled talk. So I'm very grateful to her for that. Tonight's Lakeside Chat is a story about some shells that I found on the shore of San Francisco Bay. And the story has several parts, some of which may not seem relevant at first, so try to bear with me. In order to help, I've given names to the different parts of the story. So, part one, viscosity. Viscosity is the term for how thick and sticky a fluid is. It describes how well a fluid flows. Water has a low viscosity, so it flows easily. Honey has a high viscosity, and it doesn't flow as easily. Both honey and water are Newtonian fluids that maintain a constant velocity if they're at a constant temperature. And they're called Newtonian fluids because in 1687, Isaac Newton published a formula that describes their behavior. There are also non-Newtonian fluids, fluids whose viscosity changes when they're stressed. And these are made by suspending particles in a liquid. One of these is the suspension of cornstarch in water, which forms the non-Newtonian fluid known as oobleck. Some of you may be familiar with it. If you treat oobleck gently, it acts like a liquid and you can pour it. But if you stress it in some way, like punching it, its viscosity increases and it acts like a solid. This is a very weird behavior for a fluid, very unexpected, and it's why oobleck is so much fun. Ketchup is another type of non-Newtonian fluid, which does just the opposite. Ketchup left alone acts like a solid. You turn a ketchup bottle upside down and nothing flows out. But if you stress it by shaking it up, its viscosity lowers and you can pour it. Soft mud, such as we find around in many parts of San Francisco Bay, is also a non-Newtonian fluid, a suspension of sand and clay in seawater. Depending on the mix of clay and sand and the ratio to water, it can move like oobleck or more like ketchup. There's a type of mud that I've encountered in many parts of the bay that acts like this. You can walk on it if you keep moving. So it's kind of like a spongy solid that you're walking on. But if you stop, you'll sink into it. It acts like a liquid. And then if you try to move again, suddenly move your feet to try and get going, the stress of that causes it to act like a solid again, and it holds you like hardened cement. So you know that you have to extricate your feet before you can get going if you've been standing around for a while. This is pretty common in many parts of the bay, and if you work out there, you learn sort of instinctively how to walk on this stuff. If you do venture out onto mud like this non-Newtonian fluid, you might think it's a little bit like walking on water, only a little more complicated. Part two, the site. There's a place on the Bay Shore where, starting in the 1990s, I used to bring reporters and visiting dignitaries to show them the state of biological invasions in San Francisco Bay. At this place, like many places around the bay, there are marsh plants along the shore, and there's soft bay mud of the type of mud that I was talking about just outside of the marsh plants. The plants include what appeared to be pure stands of the native cordgrass, Spartina foliosa, alongside pure stands of the exotic Atlantic cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora. The Atlantic cordgrass had been introduced into the bay in 1973 by two so-called restoration biologists who planted it at a mitigation marsh site in Hayward when they couldn't get the native Spartina to grow there, the native cordgrass to grow there. And the Atlantic cordgrass did pretty well there, and then it spread out to other sites in the bay, including the one that I'm talking about. Let me pull up a slide here to show you. Let me go a little slow at this, so screen share. And great. So in this slide, you can see a kind of paler, shorter, somewhat sparser cordgrass growing in the front part of the screen, and that's the native cordgrass, Spartina foliosa. Behind that, you see this taller, denser, darker cordgrass, which is the exotic Atlantic cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora. One of the advantages of coming out to this site, for me always, is that I have the pleasure of quoting the UC Davis professor, Don Strong, who once described these two plants and their interaction as the pushy, aggressive New York cordgrass, dominating, overgrowing, and outcompeting our wimpy, laid-back California cordgrass, the one shown in the foreground. A second advantage of this site is that a couple of yards out into the mud, there's a clay pipe, a piece of clay sewer pipe, that's the only decent-sized piece of hard substrate anywhere along this stretch of shore. And because of that, it's a gathering place for organisms and a good place for me to show the nature of organisms and invasions in San Francisco Bay. This clay pipe would have barnacles on it that were a native species, Belinus glandula. It would have a variety of exotic species also attached to it. It's different kinds of sponges from the Atlantic coast, colonial tunicates from Japan and from the Atlantic, hydrozoans from different parts of the world. There would be bryozoans from different parts of the world. There would be little isopods, little bug-like creatures. We call them roly-polies on land. So little spheromatid isopods, some from Australia and some native ones. There'd be always, pretty much always, I'd find some Atlantic oyster drills, which is a predatory snail from the Atlantic, which also laid its egg cases on top of this shell. They're little vase-shaped, beautiful little egg cases. You can see the tiny little yellow eggs inside them. And often gathered around it, there'd be some mud snails, also from the Atlantic. And the mud snails were there, although they lived on the mud, they lay their eggs on hard substrates. So they had these little crystalline boxes that were egg cases that they laid there. And sometimes there were crabs underneath, often native shore crabs, but sometimes a green crab from Europe. So this was a nice little display for me to show to people, which was an advantage to that site. One day I was out there with a reporter and a photographer. They were working on some kind of story about biological invasions. And I'd pulled a mussel off the sewer pipe and was holding it in front of me and was explaining all the tiny little organisms that were living on it. The reporter was on my side, at my side, taking notes. The photographer was standing directly in front of me. He'd put a big lens on his camera. He'd come in real close. He was hunched over this mussel, snapping photo after photo as I pointed out little tiny organisms on the mussel shell, explaining what they were. When he figured he'd got his shot, the reporter stood back up and took a step back, or he tried to take a step back, because while he was standing there taking photographs, the Newtonian fluid of bay mud underneath him had acted like a liquid. He sunk down into it. And when he suddenly tried to move his feet, they wouldn't move at all. His upper body was moving, though. So he went over backward like a felled tree. But like the professional that was, he immediately thrust his arms up into the air so that as he fell down, his back and head going splat into the mud, he had his camera as far away from the mud surface as he can, held up over him in both hands. When he fell over, the reporter shrieked out, "Oh my God," and went to help him. So she went over sideways, holding her notebook up in the air. And so I stood there, mussel still in my hand, knowing that it was going to take me a little while to get my feet out of the mud so I could go and help them, and trying not to laugh in front of them. I think I succeeded pretty well, but that was another nice thing about this site, that it was a terrific place to bring people to get acquainted with bay mud. Part 3, oysters at last. So on my first visit to that site, which was sometime in the early to maybe mid-1990s, I'm not exactly sure, but probably 1993, 1994, I'd noticed that there were a lot of shells of the native oyster, Australorida, on the beach, and that they were narrower than I was used to seeing in Australorida. I didn't think much about that because oyster shells are really variable. They have a wide range of shapes. And my focus was then really on almost entirely on the invasive species, the non-native species, and I didn't pay that much attention to the natives. Also, I didn't know very much about oysters at the time. Then around 2006, I started to get interested in the oyster restoration projects that had started up out around the bay, and I began looking into the history of the native oysters, in particular, trying to understand what human activities might have affected its numbers in the past and how they might have been affected and so on. And around that same time, a population of a non-native species, the Pacific oyster, Crassostrea gigas, was discovered in San Francisco Bay. This was not a good thing to have in San Francisco Bay, we all decided. And so I organized an eradication effort to get rid of the Pacific oyster, the non-native Japanese oyster that had gotten this population going in the bay. And we ran that effort from 2006 until 2012 when the money ran out. Let me go back to the slides and show you one of my most formidable restoration workers, eradication workers. This was my son Henry back in 2006, trying to lever an exotic oyster off of a rock there in South San Francisco Bay with the Dunbarton Bridge in the background. So we organized many people, sometimes a citizen science group, sometimes people we paid, to go out and over those 6 years try and get rid of these exotic oysters out of the bay. But in order to do that, we had to try and distinguish between the native oysters and the exotic oysters. Now, if the oysters were fully grown, that was not hard. The exotic oyster shown on the right gets a whole lot bigger than the native oyster shown on the left. These are relatively extreme examples of adults, but they were easy to tell apart when they were full grown. But we also wanted to be able to tell apart small, young of the Japanese oysters to full-grown native oysters, so we didn't mix them up and pull native species off or leave Japanese oysters behind. And this is a lot harder. So let's see, do I have a slide for this? So this is what, and part of the reason it's higher is because these oysters are, as I said, very variable shape. These are all native oysters. And so sometimes they're kind of round, like up in the upper left-hand corner, there's the two shells of an oyster collected in Richmond. And sometimes they're longer than they are wide. And so you can see a couple of these over on the right-hand side and on the left part of the ones that are marked from Dunbarton. And these tend to be as much as about twice as long as they are wide. So these are the native oysters, a pretty wide variety in shell shape. The exotic oyster had even wider varieties in shell shape. It was really what we call a very plastic organism, molding itself to different substrates and just growing in different shapes. Sometimes it would be long and narrow like this one. And sometimes 2 times or 3 times, sometimes almost 4 times as long as it was wide. And then other times you would find them and they were wider than they were long. I want to say something about these words wide and long because I'm not using them the way a scientist does. We're looking at an oyster here. The hinge part of the oyster is at the bottom of the slide, and that's called the dorsal side of the oyster. And the opposite side up at the top of this slide is the ventral side. That's where the oyster opens up. Hinge is at the bottom, oyster opening up that way. And so what a scientist would call the vertical distance here the height. But if I go back one, most oysters that height is actually the longest part of the oyster. So people who aren't scientists tend to call it the length, and the distance across here the width. The oyster scientist calls it the height and the length. I'm going to use length for the long distance, the vertical distance here, and width for the wider part for going across here, which is what most people who are not scientists call it for the rest of this talk. So my apologies to the scientists for that. Let's see. So let me get out of here. So as we were doing these invasions, doing this eradication effort, I tried to learn what I could about shell shapes. I studied a lot of the exotic oysters, a lot of the native oysters. It turns out that the exotic oyster in the bay had a greater range in shell shape in San Francisco Bay than was described in the scientific literature. And I think the reason for this is that in the scientific literature, this was an oyster that had been grown in Japan, cultivated in Japan for over 600 years. And the Pacific oysters that most people saw were farmed oysters, and maybe genetically different because of the cultivation, but also grown in particular circumstances where you tended to have a lot of oysters grown together, and they had a certain common shape to them. And that's what the scientific description was largely based on. These oysters in San Francisco Bay were a feral population. Nobody was growing them. They'd settled. We're not sure where they came from. The strongest possibility is, I think, that they came out of monitoring that we were doing in the bay for pollutants that used Japanese oysters, put them out in the bay during their spawning period, and then collected them 3 months later and saw what pollutants they'd accumulated in the meantime. We were doing this a couple of decades ago and up into the 2000s. And I suspect that this is how these got started in San Francisco Bay from organizations, including the one that I worked for, doing that. But it's possible they came in on the hull of a ship. It's possible that they came down, drifted down from places where the Pacific oyster is grown on the Pacific coast. But in any event, in San Francisco Bay, nobody was growing them. They were growing on all kinds of substrates. They were often growing singly. And so they showed a much wider range of shape than the oyster had shown when it was grown in oyster farms. And I described these observations, and they ended up changing the way this oyster was described in the most recent keys. And so I became kind of a little bit of an expert on oyster shape as a result of doing these eradications, not that I'd intended to. And so that's kind of where I was. Part 4 of this talk, in which the speaker finally pays attention to the subject of this talk. In other words, oysters at last. When I first visited that site that I mentioned, probably around 1993 or 1994, as I said, I had noticed that the native oysters were generally pretty narrow, but I didn't give it too much thought. Between 2006 and 2012, I became a little bit of an expert in oyster shell shape. And I also learned more about oysters. I didn't go to that site very much anymore. For one thing, there was an eradication program that was started to get rid of the exotic Atlantic cordgrass, and they'd gone out and sprayed out there and gotten rid of all the Atlantic cordgrass and most of the native cordgrass. So that exhibit was gone from that site. That eradication developed in part because of a paper I'd written back in 1998, so I couldn't be too upset with them. They were doing what I suggested they should do. And then that piece of clay pipe that I used as an exhibit all the time, that was gone. I don't know if during the eradication of the cordgrass that someone had taken it away, or if it got pushed under the mud by some of the equipment they were using. But anyway, it was gone. And I wasn't doing bay tours much anymore. I kind of did them up to, maybe around 2005 or so, and then rarely did them anymore. So I didn't go back to that site very much. But one day, and I don't know why I had this thought. I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what brought it back to my mind. But one day, about a quarter century after I had first seen those oysters out there, the thought came into my head that, those narrow oysters, that was pretty unusual. I mean, one narrow oyster or two narrow oysters in a bunch of other oysters, that wouldn't be a surprise because the oyster is really variable. but a whole beach full of narrow oysters, which is what I kind of remembered seeing there now. That was pretty odd, I thought. I said to myself, you ought to go back there and take a look at those oysters, that you first saw there 25 years ago. So I stopped talking to myself and I went out there. Part 5, what he found there. At the next low tide, I went out and I found I collected a handful of the larger shells from that site. And let me go back to this slides and show you what they looked like. So these are the 6 oyster shells I collected when I went out there after ordering myself to go back there. And as you can see, they are pretty narrow. Here's on the right is what the native oyster looks like again. On the left, this oyster from this one site, these narrower oysters, you can see that they tend to be narrower. And also, although these aren't quite to scale with each other, they're also longer than the native oyster usually is. And so on this one, there is actually a ruler. You can see that the longest of the shells that I collected here was over 90 millimeters long. That seemed to me pretty long compared to the oysters that I'd seen in San Francisco Bay, the native oysters that I'd seen. And so I went looking to the various oysters that I'd collected from the bay, oyster shells I'd collected and the records I had from them. And the largest one that I could find was 63 millimeters long. These here were over 90. And later, when I paid a visit to Jim Carlton, who's a longtime friend of this chat, and we went through his collections, the largest one we could find in his very extensive oyster collections of the native oyster, was 66 millimeters long. That was one he collected up in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1986. And so these seem pretty long for native oysters. To check that further, let me see what's next here, if there's a relevant slide. So here, actually, this is relevant. I graphed out the width and the length of all the oysters I had in my collection, some of them from San Francisco Bay, all the native oyster shells, some from San Francisco Bay, some old oyster shells in some shell heaps from Coos Bay, Oregon. And the green and blue on the left-hand side, those are the widths and lengths of graph the oysters, the native oysters that I had. And the red on the right-hand side were the mystery oysters. You can see they show up in different parts of the graph. The mystery oysters are further to the right, meaning that they are definitely bigger, longer than the native oysters. And then the lines that go through them show you their width to length ratio. So the width to length ratio is larger for the native oysters. That means they're not as long as they are relative to their width. Whereas the mystery oysters have a smaller width to length ratio or a longer length to width ratio. They're longer for a given length. And you can see both of these things in this chart, that they clearly fall into different areas and appear to be pretty clearly 2 different species, at least based on the oyster samples that I had available to me. So the next thing I did is to go to the scientific literature. And let's see, this is part 6 of my talk. And I want to introduce this with a quote. The name of this part of the talk is Tangent Number 1, How Big is Australorida? So my favorite quote about science is this quote, research is the process of going up alleys to see if they're blind. It's usually attributed to a well-known ecologist no longer with us named Marston Bates, as you can see in all these posters here. But sometimes the quote is attributed to the Greek philosopher and the priest of the Temple of Apollo, Plutarch. And occasionally, much less often, it's attributed to Mark Russell, a piano-playing political comedian who died earlier this year. It turns out that none of these guys ever said that quote. It instead came from a guy named Barstow Bates, whom no one has ever heard of. That's another story, and I'm not going to get into it here. But About that quote, research is the process of going up alleys to see if they're blind. Sometimes the alleys go through. Sometimes the alleys you go through are blind, and sometimes they just lead to side alleys. What we're on now is a side alley. And the question is, how big is Australorida? So I went to the literature, to scientific literature, to see what it reported as the maximum shell length attained by the native oyster Australorida. And what I found was just a mess. According to different authors, Australorida's maximum size was 50 or 51 millimeters, 55 millimeters, 60 millimeters, 64 millimeters, 70 millimeters, 75 or 76 millimeters, 80 millimeters, 80 or 90 millimeters, or 100 millimeters. And here I've graphed out the different publications that, that describe the maximum length of Australorida. And you can see all these different sizes up on the left-hand side. And you can see that there'd be an initial author who would say it was, say, 75 millimeters, and then there'd be a bunch of people later who cited it, and so on and so forth. And these go in through time. So part of what's going on here is completely legitimate. It's that we, as over time, in the early days, people have collected a small number of oysters, and they report the biggest one in that batch. Over time, people collect more oysters, they collect them from more areas, and sometimes it's a bigger oyster, and so they report a larger oyster, and the maximum size reported in the literature grows. So that accounts for some of this, but not for a good part of it. What I look to try and understand this, for example, let me tell you about one problem that I found with this, is I looked to the lineages of these quotations. Here's a kind of complicated slide I put together, and it starts at the top. I don't know, I don't see the whole thing on my screen, but it starts at the top with a report in 1952 by Fitch, that oysters were what he said is they seldom exceeded 2.5 inches long. And then in 1954, we go down a little bit. It was Abbott saying that they're 2 to 3 inches long, based on what Fitch had said. He's not exactly quoting Fitch, he's kind of misquoting them. And then there are other people who, based on Abbott, cite other size. Hertlein says 75 millimeters, which is the conversion into the metric system of 3 inches long. Paul and Fader in 1976, over on the left, say 5.1 to 7.6 centimeters, which is the conversion into the metric system, the exact conversion into the metric system of Abbott's 2 to 3 inches, and so on. And different people are derived from others. I'm going to look at one of these lineages, which starts with Fitch at the top, which I can't see, I don't know if you can, down to Abbott, down to Paul and Fader, down to Arakawa, 1990 on the left, and then back to Grossholtz on the, moving back towards the middle, Grossholtz and Zabin, who are scientists here in the Bay Area. And so if we look at this lineage, this is what happened. Fitch in 1972 said that the oyster seldom exceeds 2.5 inches. That's accurate from what we knew at that time, and still kind of more or less accurate. Abbott in 1954 in his Shells of North America, based on Fitch, is his only source for oyster length, quotes the two, instead of saying 2.5 inches, says 2 to 3 inches. Well, that's not accurate. It's a misstatement, a misquote of what Fitch had said. Then Paul and Fader turned that to the metric system. Arakawa in 1990 take Paul and Fader's accurate translation into the metric system and approximates it with 5 to 8 inches, from 5.1 to 7.6 centimeters to 5 to 8 centimeters. Now that's to the nearest centimeter, that's correct. But then Grossholtz and Zabin take the number from Arakawa, apparently the only one who came up with it, and said they're 80 millimeters, which is kind of a false level of accuracy now, because Arakawa was just roughly to 80 millimeters, and he in turn was citing a translation of an inaccurate misstatement of what Fitch had said back in 1972. And so in this way, we got from 2.5 inches, which is a 6.3 millimeters, up to 80 millimeters, which is, so the oyster has grown 16.5 millimeters simply because of conversions between the metric and imperial system and people quoting other people and rounding off at various times and so on. And so that was the whole 80 millimeter and 75 millimeter and 76 millimeter lineage that was on the previous chart. And so that one is, as I said in this slide, based on a lineage of errors. The largest number, the 100 millimeter, I called up the original authors who had quoted that number and asked them where that number came from. Was there a specimen somewhere, or where did that come from? And they kind of looked up their notes and they said, oh, sorry, that was a mistake. So the original authors have disavowed the 100 millimeters. And then the 89 to 90 millimeters, which is extensively cited by a lot of people, especially in Canada. That's pretty much the number they cite up in Canada, is 90 millimeters as the maximum size of the native oyster. It came from a couple of field guides, Audubon field guides, actually 3 Audubon field guides that were published in the early 1980s. The later 2 of them quoted the first one, and the first one was the National Audubon Field Guide to North American Seashore Creatures. So it was written by someone who wasn't a specialist in oysters, probably not even a specialist in bivalves or clams, covering a really broad range of things. So getting an occasional measurement wrong in a volume like a Field Guide to North American Seashore Creatures wouldn't be very surprising. There was no reference to it. The authors of all those field guides are now dead. We can't go back and find where it came from. And so, but it probably is some kind of error that has now been quoted extensively. So as far as we know, the largest oysters from the literature are really around the high 60s to maybe low 70 millimeters, a little bit bigger than the largest one that Jim Carlton had. And I found some specimens that fall into that range. So around 70 millimeters seems to be the biggest Australorida around. That would take us to the next part of the talk, which is part 7, called Tangent Number 2, How Do You Measure an Oyster? But I didn't prepare any slides for that. So I'm kind of just say that there are several different ways to measure an oyster that are there in the literature. For clams, which are pretty symmetrical, there's an agreed upon method. But when you try to transfer it to oysters, whose shape is highly variable, it becomes very hard to actually specify what you mean by length and width and thickness, or as the scientists call it, height and length and width. And there are at least 3 distinct measures that come up with 3 different amounts. It's generally agreed that the length is from the hinge side to the opposite side, or from the dorsal side to the ventral side, as they're called. But exactly what part of the hinge side to what part of the ventral side is stated differently by different authors, which gives you different answers for a lot of oysters that have, if they're at all distorted and don't have a completely symmetrical shape. And then the studies that have been written often don't tell you which method they're using. Sometimes they tell you, they say, I'm using the method of Galtz that Galtzoff used in 1964, but they include an illustration from Klaus in 1996, which shows a completely different method of measuring. And then sometimes they give you a diagram which doesn't make any sense. So those are the choices usually. They don't tell you, they tell you one thing but show you another, or they show you something which doesn't make any sense. Occasionally they actually tell you and show you an illustration that shows the same method, but different studies use different methods. So it becomes very hard to know precisely what's meant by the length of an oyster in the literature. Hence we're around about 70 millimeters. And that was another side alley off of a side alley that we just went through. So now back to the main blind alley. On to part 8. So what the heck are these oysters? Having determined that these were not native oysters, I then went about trying to find out what oysters these were. First, I looked up all the oysters that had been reported to ever having been introduced into San Francisco Bay or into the west coast of North America. There are oysters from Australia, oysters from Mexico, oysters from the Atlantic, and determined that these oysters, the shells that I had in San Francisco Bay were not any of those oysters. I then took pictures of the oysters, took those photos that I showed you, and I sent them to various oyster experts and bivalve experts, both in this country and in other countries. And none of them could say that it resembled any oyster that they knew. I then went to this masterwork, which was produced by a guy named Martin Huber over in Germany in 2010. in which he included a photograph of nearly every bivalve in the world, including apparently every oyster in the world and probably every common oyster in the world. And that's what's up on the screen here. These are 2 pages from about 10 pages of oyster photographs that he has. And it didn't match, and these oysters did not match well, as it turns out, with the pictures and descriptions of any of these oysters. And so I was left, without anything really for this oyster. Now, one of the things about this oyster bed, some evidence that we had from this oyster bed, suggested that it was probably a bed of commercially grown oysters. The things that suggested this was, first of all, the number of oysters in a small beach area. Secondly, the fact that they occurred in these dense lenses in various parts of this relatively small stretch of beach, a few hundred yards of beach, and several dense lenses of oysters. And then in those lenses of oysters, I could find pretty frequently oysters that were there, 2 oyster shells together. Still, there was no oyster left, no tissue, but the 2 oyster shells were still together, indicating that this was not a very old deposit of oysters, not more than 100 years old. This wasn't some fossilized bed of oysters, and that they were still there in growth position. The ventral side where they open pointed up, and the hinge side downward, and they're buried in the mud that way. And all of this strongly suggested that this was actually a bed of oysters that people had planted and were growing there. That was a helpful thing because it meant that I shouldn't have to look at every oyster in the world, that it wasn't going to be some rare, barely known oyster, but it was going to be some fairly common oyster that people harvested commercially somewhere in some part of the world, and that brought the numbers down. But still, I couldn't figure out what they were. The best candidates I had were oysters in the genus Crassostria, and here's one of them is actually in this on the right-hand page on your screen, in the second row from the bottom in the middle. And that's Crassostria hongkongensis. And that was one of the things, one of the 2 oysters that seemed closest. The other one was this. This is a picture of what on the East Coast they call raccoon oysters. These are oysters of the common Virginia oyster, Crassostria virginica, that grow on very soft mud. And when they grow into soft mud, they, for some reason, tend to grow longer. It's thought that many of them, because this is a non-Newtonian fluid, remember, many of them sink down into this non-Newtonian fluid. And in order to be able to keep opening up and filtering the water and to live, they put all their growth effort into growing longer rather than wider or thicker. And so they tend to grow relatively narrow. They don't grow any longer than the native Virginia oyster would grow, but they grow to their full length quicker. And so that keeps them from being buried in the mud. At least that's the thinking in these very soft, muddy sites where they have a tendency to sink down into the mud. And then the regular Virginia oyster looks more like the Pacific oysters that they both looked at. It's not nearly as long or thin as this mystery oyster from San Francisco Bay. The other main oyster that seemed to match very well in its shape with the oysters from San Francisco is this. This is the Hong Kong oyster, Crassostria hongkongensis. It also grows on notoriously soft mud. And the mud is so soft that the people, and it's harvested there, it's a commonly harvested oyster, that the oyster workers, the oyster harvesters, have had to build this specialized mud sled out of a slab of wood on the bottom and an upright handle on the top that they push along like a scooter, pushing with one leg and moving them across this soft mud. Apparently they can do it pretty quickly and quite safely and move big distances over the bed and bag up the oysters and sludge them back on their mud sled. And so this mud is really very soft. And so that's another thing. The problem with both of these oysters, the reason we know they're not the mystery oyster in San Francisco Bay, is that there's a particular characteristic of these San Francisco Bay oysters. Here's one of the ones that I collected at first, which is shown in this little square here. They have this characteristic row of bumps growing along the edge of the shell near the hinge end of the shell. That's the hinge area over there on the right. And you can see them a little better in a close-up here. And so these little bumps have a special name. They're called chomata, C-H-O-M-A-T-A, from some Greek word, and I don't know what it originally meant, but chomata. And so these comata are characteristic of oysters in the genus Austria, which is what the native oyster in the bay, Austria lorida, is in. But we know these aren't native oysters because they're too narrow and too long. But they do appear to belong in that genus. The genus of the Hong Kong oyster and the raccoon oyster and Virginia oyster is Crassostria, which is a genus which does not have comata. And so we know that these cannot be Crassostria hongkongensis, the Hong Kong oyster, or the Virginia oyster, Crassostria virginica. It must be something else, and it's very likely something in the genus Austria. So that's what we got: a commercial oyster, probably common in some part of the world, harvested commercially somewhere in some part of the world, probably in the genus Austria, but this long shape, which no oyster in the genus Austria seems to have. And that's where I got stumped. And brings us to part 9. If you look like you're getting stuck in the mud, keep going. So I kept going, and I kept looking through the literature and trying to find something. And eventually I came across this plate in a paper published by Leo Hertlein in 1951. If you've been paying attention, close attention, which I'm sure you all have, you'll remember from 10 slides back where I showed those lineages of oysters that Leo Hertlein was the first guy to describe the Austria lorida as being 75 millimeters long, translating into the metric system the misstatement of Fitch's 2.5-inch oyster statement in 1952. But anyway, that Leo Hertlein, he published a paper on Mexican oysters in 1951. And for various reasons, he had this plate in it, which is a picture of the Chilean oyster, a commonly harvested oyster in Chile, Austraea, in the genus Austraea chilensis. And when you see pictures of Austria, this Chilean oyster, illustrations of it online, you can, it's a commonly harvested, and so there's lots of illustrations of it and photos of it and so on. They look like the oysters on the right, kind of rounded, not very long relative to how wide they are, like the common oyster in San Francisco Bay, Austria lorida. They look nothing like the oyster on the left, this long oyster, which looks like the mystery oyster in San Francisco Bay. But here it was in this plate in Leo Hertlein. The oysters on the right are pictures that he got of Austraea chilensis from the original description of that species. It's called the type species. The illustration on the left was a reproduction from an atlas of Chilean shells that was published in Coquimbo, Chile in 1854. Now, I haven't been able to get a copy of the original atlas to take a look at it, but here is this long oyster identified by knowledgeable biologists as the oyster Austraea chilensis, and it has the same shape, and again has the comata, the bumps on the edge of its shell, which are characteristic of the mystery oyster in San Francisco Bay. It's also a commercially harvested oyster, the thing we were looking for. And beyond that, we know that ships in the 1800s would come to San Francisco by way of going around the southern end of the South America. And when they came around the Horn, the dangerous passage around the Horn, they would almost always stop in Chile to make sure their ship was all right, to take on more stores, to repair things a little bit, because it was a really rough passage. They would stop off somewhere in Chile on their way into San Francisco. And so it wouldn't be surprising if at some point, in fact, it'd be surprising at some point, some ship captain didn't take on a load of Chilean oysters to bring them into San Francisco for people to try and grow there, because there was a lot of interest in growing oysters in the late 1800s, trying other types of oysters. As I said, they tried oysters from the Atlantic, of course. They tried oysters from Mexico. They tried oysters from Australia. None of them really took in the bay. Wouldn't be at all surprising if this Chilean oyster was brought up there at some point and some time. And so you put all this together, and then there's one other thing about all of this. I think I showed a slide earlier, and I'm going to go back to it. Yes, which is this slide, which displays the map of places where oyster beds had been, where oysters had been commercially grown within San Francisco Bay. And as it turns out, the place where I found these mystery oysters is not in any of the places where there was a bed, where oysters were known to be grown commercially. Well, that's a little bit of a problem if we're doing a commercial. If we think it's a commercial oyster bed brought in from Chile, because they probably would have grown it in around or in one of the same beds where they were already growing other oysters that had been brought down either from Washington State or brought in from the East Coast, which is what we grew in San Francisco Bay. But although it wasn't on the map, I went and looked through newspapers of the latter half of the 19th century, the latter part of the 1800s. And it turns out that although it's not on the map, on this map, this site where I found these oysters was a place where commercial oysters were known to be grown commercially. And in fact, it may even be a place, sounds like it probably is, an oyster bed that was mentioned by Jack London in one of his stories in the Tales of the Oyster Pirates, not as a bed of Chilean oysters, but just as an oyster bed that was there on the side of the bay. And so putting all these things together, I feel pretty sure that these oysters that I found in San Francisco Bay, that are clearly not the native oyster and clearly are not anything that we know to have been grown or introduced into the San Francisco Bay or ever even brought into the San Francisco markets, which someone might have tried to grow out in San Francisco Bay, but is rather this Chilean oyster, which nobody knew had ever been grown in San Francisco Bay before. I think, pretty sure it's going to turn out like that. I haven't yet gotten any oyster shells from Chile to compare them directly. That's the next step and really the final step in trying to do this. And if they match up well, then I think we've got a pretty good case here that that's what this is. And so my happening to notice these oysters 30 years ago on this part of San Francisco Bay, which I basically ignored for 25 years until for some day I thought of them and thought I should go and take another look at them, that this turns out to tell us about an oyster that no one had known was ever in San Francisco Bay, and also about a commercial enterprise and an international trade connection that had previously been unknown in San Francisco Bay, all by trying to unravel the story, as tortured as it was, that these oyster shells were trying to tell us. So that's my story, and thank you for listening to it. And if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Wow, thank you. That is quite a story. You stuck with it for a long, long time and brought in all of your scientific knowledge and to bear on this interesting occurrence that we would all walk by. So it is an incredible, fabulous detective story, according to Jean. And okay, I'm going to tell the dog to stop barking. Do we have some questions here? Are we seeing some questions in the chat? Put your questions in the chat, please. So Janai Southworth wanted to ask you if you've checked to see if they have a specimen at the Cal Academy.
Yes, I have. They don't have any Chilean oysters there. And I've looked around in some of the other museums in the country and elsewhere in the world. They have their collections are listed online. It isn't always their total collections, and I've not been able to find them there. So I have some folks that I can try and contact in Chile. The oyster actually has this oyster has a very strange native distribution. It's found in both, like a number of other species. It's found both in New Zealand and in Chile, and that's apparently a natural distribution. Fossil evidence suggests that this is a natural distribution for this oyster. So I have some other folks in New Zealand who I may be able to have send me this oyster. This has been kind of a hobby trying to figure this out. I haven't really borne down on trying to get it done. I should write those folks and ask them to send me some. I'm sure they'd be happy to do it. And we could finally settle this question, which I've been kind of playing with now for about 5 years.
I'm curious, do these oysters died out after being So they were a basic, had to be tended and farmed in order to survive in the bay. Is that usually the case, or do we have the other imported oysters taking root in the bay and having populations?
Well, there are two parts to that answer of, how, did they die out? Is that common for things to die out?
Yeah.
Once they are here, clearly there were a lot of oysters on this one beach. And so one of the things that's I think not appreciated, but I think which is really quite true, that despite the large number of invasive species that we see in different parts of the world, and marine species that we see in some areas like San Francisco Bay, it's actually really hard, I believe, for most species to become established in a new site if they're marine species, and especially if they're marine species that have planktonic young, little tiny larvae that float around in the water, and especially if they float in the water for some time. There are some things that only are floating around the water for a few hours or maybe a day, but if they're spending days or weeks or months in the plankton, then those larvae must get tremendously dispersed if they're introduced into San Francisco Bay. San Francisco Bay is a very shallow bay, and the tidal prism, the amount of water that flows in and flows out, is something like 40% of the total volume of San Francisco Bay flows in and out on average with each tidal cycle. Now, a lot of that flows out and then comes right back in, but some of it mixes with the ocean, and so you're bringing in different water, and there's this churning of the water back and forth. It's not only moving around San Francisco Bay, it's also moving from the bay out to the ocean. And so I think that unless there's an awful lot of larvae and an awful lot of places where they might settle together, it's very hard for an organism with planktonic larvae to settle. In fact, when I first started studying invasions, and still to me to this day, I'm surprised that some species that have planktonic larvae have in fact become established, that so many species carried in ballast water, for example, have become established. Should think it would be really quite hard, but the evidence is clear that they do. And so that happens sometimes. Now, if we think this oyster was commercially grown, then there were a lot of oysters in one place. But these oysters are they're actually free spawning. They put both the eggs and the sperm go out in the water. They mix in the water. They spend weeks at least out in the water column. They have a lot of potential for dispersal. Oysters tend to be gregarious settlers. That is, the larvae settle down where there are native oysters of the same species, specifically. Maybe they like other oysters, but they particularly look their own oysters. And that's one of the ways that larvae that have been out there roaming around in the water column for a long time can actually come back together, because they're all looking for places where there already are natives, already are adults of the same species, and that brings them back together where they can grow up and then reproduce themselves and do this mass spawning of putting sperm and eggs out into the water. But if there's only one place in the bay where there are adult oysters, then these oysters could spawn, put a lot of larvae out into the water column. They'd spread out in the bay, and few or none of them might find their way back to where the adult oysters were. And so they might settle down in places where there's not enough of them and a dense enough congregation that when they release their eggs and sperm out into the water, which they have mechanisms to do this synchronously at the same time. If you've got a lot of adult oysters in the same place, that's something else. You need a lot of adult oysters typically to trigger synchronous spawning. So they need to do that. So they spawn all at the same time. They get them out in the water column if you've got a lot of oysters together. But if there's not that many oysters, they may not spawn synchronously, in which case they won't be able to reproduce. Even if they spawn synchronously, they may be putting up between them, even though there's a lot of oysters of sperm and eggs per oyster, there still may not be enough of them out into the water column for them to combine and create larvae. And then even if they do create larvae, there may not be enough larvae to then settle in large numbers to produce the next generation. It's sort of a continuing problem. And so it can be quite hard to get established. And even if you've got a lot of adults in one place, there's a pretty good chance that they're not going to actually establish themselves until they really have themselves around a bunch of places in something like an oyster, which releases its eggs and sperm out into the water, and the larvae spend a lot of time in the water column. So that's a possibility. So we do know that we had this exotic oyster here in the bay, Crassostrea gigas, the Japanese oyster, what we call the Pacific oyster. We do know that we had it in the bay. We were at work eradicating it. And we did some work to age the oysters that we had, to figure out what their age were by examining the isotopes in the shell. And what we figured out is that of the oysters we had in the bay, it appeared that they'd been around for a while, maybe a decade, and they'd only managed to settle successfully twice in that decade. And so even though we know that this oyster is capable of living in this at this latitude, because we grow them further south and we grow them further north, and they're abundant up further north, and the temperature seems like it would be okay for them all in all. It turns out that it's actually pretty hard for them to put a new recruited generation out there. And so that may be an indication again of how hard it is for these oysters that spawn in this way to actually become established in the bay.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, Andrew, can you stick around for a little while after 8, like till around 8:30?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to ask if we could possibly take a short pause to do our end of program, thank yous and so forth. It'll take like less than 5 minutes, and then we'll open back up. We have a great question from Robert Kidd.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe we should do that first.
Yeah.
And then we'll do the credits. And then I want to show you a picture of a couple oysters found in Lake Merritt in the last few years. I just wanted to show you them. But anyway,
Katie.
Yeah. Yes.
No, let's do our ending credits first, and then come back to Robert's great question, which is: can the San Francisco oyster industry be revived?
Okay.
And we hope to see you all there.
Well, okay, I'm good with that also. So just one quick moment, please. I'll share my screen and we'll do this. And let's see, where are we now? Oh boy. Okay, so we are going to go here.
The oyster measurements.
Okay.
I'll be right there.
Okay, I'm going to stop. And actually, why don't you take that question while I futz with my PowerPoint? Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Andrew. Could you take the question from Robert Kidd? Can the San Francisco oyster industry be revived, do you think?
Did you want to add to your question, Robert?
Yikes.
Oh, I love oysters, and I go out to buy oysters whenever I can out at Tamales Bay. But I understand there used to be a thriving industry here in the bay, and for reasons unknown to me, it disappeared, and so I'm wondering if it can make a comeback.
Well, it could. Now, the nature of that industry is that it was based on continually importing oysters as young oysters, newly settled oysters, and then growing them up in San Francisco Bay. There are actually three different species that had been grown here. The first one was because, contrary to what you may have learned about San Francisco Bay, there were no commercially harvestable beds in San Francisco Bay when the bay was discovered or in the early years of settlement. There's our whole oyster restoration program is built on the understanding that there were abundant beds of oysters that the Native Americans had harvested at the time when white men first arrived, and then the settlers harvested them, and then they disappeared either because of overharvesting or because of pollution or because of sediment washed down from hydraulic mining in the Sierra for gold in the Sierra Nevada, or some combination of those. And then the oyster was gone from the bay, basically disappeared from the bay, and was rediscovered in 1990 I believe it was, and then the oyster restoration program started up in the year 2000, and we've been working since then to restore native oysters. In fact, restore beds of oysters to San Francisco Bay. In fact, there were no native beds of oysters in San Francisco Bay when white men first came here. And so in 1851, after the gold rush got going, there were beds of native oysters. There were beds of native oysters further north, most of them up in Washington and British Columbia, in a few bays in Oregon, but not further south than there. And so what we started doing in 1851, shortly after the gold rush got going, is we began bringing oysters down from Willapa Bay, Washington, occasionally from other bays up there, and planting them in San Francisco Bay, and letting them grow up to be larger oysters, and then marketing them in the San Francisco markets. And so those were the first beds of oysters in San Francisco. And so that continued until 1869. That was the only oyster industry. And then in 1869, we began importing, which was the year that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. They drove the Golden Spike at Promontory, Utah. Some of you may remember that part of the history. And so as soon as that railroad was completed, we started shipping oysters over from the East Coast. They were packed in barrels and carried across. Some of them were sold in the market, and others were planted in San Francisco Bay. And the industry grew up by bringing over young oysters and putting them in the bay and growing them up and then bringing them into market. And there were large beds of oysters. There are these lovely old photographs of the oyster beds out in San Francisco Bay. And they were growing either the East Coast oyster, Crassostrea virginica, brought over in the trains, or they were growing oysters from what was then known as Shoalwater Bay, which is now Willapa Bay up in Washington, and brought down by ships and planted in San Francisco Bay. And so that was the oyster industry through the latter part of the 1800s. Mostly it was the Virginia oyster, because that was a lot bigger oyster and a lot easier to make money off of generally. And so that continued until around 1910. And in around 1910 or so, the oysters started, the description in the literature is that the oysters started to get kind of watery and didn't seem quite right, and no one really knew what it was. And then the oyster industry kind of died out. What may have been a more important factor, although that's the story we tell about San Francisco Bay, what may have been a more important factor was that the Virginia oyster was being successfully grown up in more northern areas, and so there was a lot of competition now for San Francisco Bay. There were concerns that oyster beds may be getting polluted in San Francisco Bay, so that may have hurt the market for San Francisco Bay. And anyway, for some combination of reasons, we usually say that you usually find a literature that say the statement that pollution caused the industry to die out, but they never really say what kind of pollution. We don't know of any kind of pollution that was like bay-wide. Usually pollution is a local event that would have entirely eliminated the growth of oysters over the whole area. And so I don't really know, and I don't think anybody really knows why we stopped farming oysters in San Francisco Bay around between 1910 and 1920. But that's when it got stopped. And then in 1930s, by that time, this Japanese oyster, Crassostrea gigas, had become a much more commonly grown oyster. A lot of different areas were growing them. They were growing them up north. And so in the mid-1930s, we started growing the Japanese oyster in San Francisco Bay. Again, it was the kind of industry where they brought in oysters from Japan, young oysters called oyster spat, would lay them out in the bay. They'd grow up to larger oysters. They'd then bring them into market. In both cases, and this is like what happened with the population of Japanese oysters we had in San Francisco Bay in 2006. In both cases, the Virginia oyster, grown in the bay in large numbers from 1869 to the early 1900s, and the Japanese oyster, which was grown from the early 1930s until basically World War II stopped the importing of Japanese oysters that in large numbers during that time. Neither of them ever got established in San Francisco Bay. Occasionally there would be oysters that settled, but a wild population of those oysters never never picked up. Again, an indication of how hard it can be to get yourself established in a new area if you have these larvae that disperse very broadly. And so could we start it up again? Probably could start it up using the same mechanisms. If we worked hard enough at it, we might get one of those exotic oysters growing in San Francisco Bay. But before we're going to be able to successfully do that, we're going to have to figure out why it is there were no beds of native oysters in San Francisco Bay. And the people doing oyster restoration aren't figuring that out. And they're not figuring it out because they believe that there were native beds of oysters in San Francisco Bay from the beginning when San Francisco was first settled. And so they're not really looking for the real cause. They're looking for something that happened after that. They're not looking very hard, frankly. And they're not looking for what got rid of native oysters long before the time when the Spanish found San Francisco Bay, because in fact, the native oyster was very abundant in San Francisco Bay, but a very long time ago. Back around 2,000 years ago, there were very large beds of oysters. They were harvested in large numbers by the Native Americans. They did make large beds of oysters inside shell mounds around San Francisco Bay of that rather old age, or in big shell mounds in the lower part of the shell mound. And then all of a sudden, no oysters at a certain level about 2,000 years ago. And then above that, there are hardly any oysters at all to be seen. That's why we know it was about 2,000 years ago, as well as some geological evidence. But so there were very large beds of oysters in the bay at one time. They were harvested in large numbers. They helped to build the very oldest shell mounds in San Francisco Bay, but not any of the more recent shell mounds. And unless we understand why oysters disappeared then, we're not likely to be able to establish a population in the bay today. Although we could do what we did back in the late 1800s or in the 1930s and bring in young oysters from elsewhere and grow them. Whether anybody would want to eat the oysters in San Francisco Bay is the next question, because San Francisco Bay, although it's getting better, is still more polluted than other sites along the coast. And so it's not a place where probably where anyone wants to invest any significant amount of money in getting an industry going. But someday, if we clean it up enough, they might. And Robert Kidd will be able to eat oysters from San Francisco Bay.
I'm looking forward to it.
That is a really fascinating story. And I believe, Andrew, you have a presentation up on the UC Museum of Paleontology about the long history of the native oyster in the bay. I'll share that with people in the post-chat email.
That's an old presentation, and yes. I think it's accurate, but it was done. I've done a lot more investigation into the issue since then. Yeah, it's the first time I talked about it. And to me, it just seems established beyond any possibility of doubt that they were abundant till 2,000 years, and then they disappeared, and they were not abundant when the Bay Area was first settled. And that's why we imported oysters from other areas, from other parts of the West Coast, starting in 1851.
Incredible. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to try to we can continue. I'm going to show our end of program slides if all goes well. Wait a minute. Okay, so I'm going to need Rob to help me out because I'm getting a second camera and I don't have a second camera. And okay, basic. Oh yeah, here we go. We're in. Okay. Okay. Now this should work. Okay. Should probably work. It doesn't look terrible. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and especially Dr. Cohen, Rotary Nature Center friends and staff, Lake Merritt Boating Center, Lake Merritt Institute, all of the people who are participating in our programs this month and this year. Special thank you for Dr. Cohen. And we're looking forward to seeing you in December. So coming up, okay, tomorrow, in fact, we are going to have an iNaturalist Lake Merritt Survivors Bio Blitz at the Lake Merritt Voting Center docks to check out and document species that are now living at Lake Merritt after a severe loss of life in August of 2022. Nearly everything died, but it bounced right back, actually. And then it had another terrible event occur, which was the atmospheric rivers and an extended fresh period, which caused the death of a lot of the dock life and organisms at the base of the food chain. But how are things now? We're going to investigate that, seeing what species we might find. So come by and help us out or see what we're doing. Just a note, there's $5 parking charge now to enter and park in Lakeside Park, but you can often park on side streets and walk in or bike in. Our Lakeside Chat number 37, coming up on December 1st, will feature winter birds in the nation's first wildlife refuge with Golden Gate Bird Alliance naturalist Clayton Anderson. So that should be special. He's going to be filming out. We're going to be filming him out at Lake Merritt, looking at the birds. Our Adopt a Spot Workday is the third Saturday, and that falls on the 16th this month. Watch our Facebook and other media to see about what we're going to actually be doing on that day. But we do like to get out and make things cleaner and more inviting to people coming by to enjoy the lake and learn about natural history of the lake. Finally, the Golden Gate Bird Alliance Christmas count registration has started. If you want to participate, you don't have to be a bird wonk, a bird specialist to enjoy and to help out. So go to the website and see how you might want to participate. We have here's a slide showing the harmful algal bloom at Lake Merritt. Are there any survivors? iNaturalist project that we started in October of last year, and that led to the discovery of so many nudibranchs that were out there, which kind of surprised us. But what we've done is we've reopened that project, and so please, if you want to be part of the iNaturalist project, you can still sign in and follow the registration process. There are 2 steps. Just don't miss out on the last one, where you have to go down to the bottom of the page and say, yes, I want to join the project. So moving forward, if you like what we've been doing and presenting our free online Zoom programs and also reaching out to young people and others in the community enjoying Lake Merritt, please consider making a donation. We're using our donation button on our website. This helps us to keep the materials and supplies and equipment ready for use for everybody, so they can enjoy science and sustainability activities. This is what it looks like when you go to our website. That's where the donate button is. We would like to thank also the City of Oakland's KTOP channel 10 TV, that you can in fact go to and see the current program rebroadcast after some light editing in the last 2 weeks of the month on Sundays from 6 to 7 p.m. In the first 2 weeks of the month, the KTOP offers a selection of older presentations. And in our post-chat email, we will be sending you a link to our playlist so that you can see all the many topics that we've discussed in the last 2 years. We're actually almost finishing 3 years of programming. We'd like to thank our producer, Rob Lamone, for helping with all of our production, media, videos, and producing the Lakeside Chat program. We want to thank the San Francisco Elks Lodge number 3 for generous grants every year to help us do our programs. The Frederick E. Hart Foundation for educational opportunity. the Lake Merritt Institute, New Voices Are Rising, City of Oakland, Lake Merritt Rowing Club has been very helpful in allowing us to go out on their boats to test water, and the City of Oakland and Youth Employment Partnership. Said in another way, and then so we are Rotary Nature Center Friends, a citizens group, and a 501c3 nonprofit advocating for the Rotary Nature Center in Lakeside Park and delivering interpretive nature and science programs for the whole community. And that is the end. I just couldn't resist mentioning that native oysters were discovered in Lake Merritt by Damon Ty in 2020. And we saw a lot of oysters, shells actually stuck to this piece of dock at the Lake Chalet. I think some of them, this is the top, so these could have fallen on, but there were shells that were actually stuck to this piece of floating dock, so it's kind of intriguing. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share and thank all of you for being here, and we have a few more minutes to talk to Andrew. So please, let's check the chat. Are there more questions? Jerry Lips asks, when did these various kinds of oysters come into the bay? So you mentioned 3 or 4 different species. I think.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to, but there were several types of oysters in the 19th century, late 19th century, that were attempted to be grown in the bay. So these were all, I don't know, probably around 1870s, 1880s, I think. There was one species from Australia, 2 from Mexico. Of course, the Virginia oyster was grown here, as I mentioned, the Pacific oyster in the 30s. And then this other oyster is in an area of beds that were in the late 1800s. And it probably was grown around the same time that people were trying the Mexican and Australian oysters in here. And so as far as I know, those are the only oysters that have been found in San Francisco Bay. There is a giant fossil oyster that's found in some deposits in the Bay Area, but I've never seen fossil shells or any shells of anything that big. It's really a huge oyster in San Francisco Bay or around San Francisco Bay.
Well, I would say to some extent, your last response to Robert Kidd's question in a bit answered or the question of when were these various species introduced, because we became clear that 2,000 years ago, the native species disappeared, and that during and following European arrival in the 49ers, various species, particularly the East Coast species and the one from up near Washington, were introduced and farmed. And apparently perhaps the one from Chile came in and became farmed at that time as well.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, David. I don't think that the native oyster disappeared from the bay 2,000 years ago. But what happened was that the large beds of oysters that were big enough and dense enough that people could reasonably harvest them and feed themselves off it, that those disappeared. I think the oyster's been in the bay continually. I think I'm pretty sure the oyster was here when the bay was settled, and then every year all the way up through. There was a story in the Chronicle in 1999. It was on the front page of Chronicle, took up about 2/3 of the paper, about the long lost native oyster being rediscovered in San Francisco Bay. And it said that the oyster hadn't been in the bay for 150 years. That clearly was not true. We'd been collecting the oyster every time we went out and sampled the bay. There were some places where it was pretty common, but it wasn't in beds big enough and of the right type for anyone to harvest them and feed off of them. And as near as I can tell, going back through the literature, that's how it's been continuously, that the oyster has been at about the same level. They're common in some areas, at least in certain years, but they're never really abundant. They're never in these sort of dense congregations that we consider to be enough to actually harvest a significant number of oysters out of. You could get oysters out of the bay at any time in the last few decades, and you could get them out of the bay today, but you'd have to work really hard to like get enough oysters to feed one meal to your family. It would take a substantial amount of work, and there's just no way you could do it commercially. So that's what I think the shift was 2,000 years ago, and that's what we're trying to reproduce now. There's, the oyster restoration goals are to restore hundreds of acres of oyster beds to San Francisco Bay. But of course they wouldn't be doing that because they're thinking there were hundreds of acres of oyster beds in, the 1800s or in the late 1700s when the bay was discovered, and there just weren't. So whatever they're doing, it wouldn't be restoration. Up till now, they haven't been at all successful. There isn't a single square foot of restored native oyster bed, as far as I know, in San Francisco Bay. They report 14 acres, but those are just some structures they've stuck out there. Nowhere near 14 acres of them. It's not even an acre of them. It's probably not even a half or a quarter acre of them that they actually cover. And there are some oysters growing on these concrete structures, but those are not restored native oyster beds. As far as that goes, I haven't seen anything out there that I would say is even a square foot of restored native oyster bed.
I have two quick questions, if I may. One would be whether or not I'm correct in assuming the current commercial fish oyster beds along up in the northern coast, in the Tomales Bay region, are eastern oysters. Is the first question, and hopefully that's a quick one.
Well, actually, they're mostly the Pacific oyster, the Japanese oyster.
Really?
There may be some eastern oysters grown in some areas. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure they're not. I think it's either primarily or entirely the Japanese oysters. It's actually it's now been divided into three different species, the Japanese oyster, and at least two of them are grown on this coast, I believe. And there's also some people grow native oysters. It's a more specialized market, but there are some Australorida that are grown in the farm. So if there are Virginia oysters, it's not many of them, and I'm not sure there are any grown on this coast.
Perhaps we'll take the question as food for thought. We'll see. I'm not sure how old oysters are and when they show up in the scheme of the evolution of life on this planet. But you mentioned the relationship that they experience in soft mud and the way that they form and shape themselves given the environment that they're in. And I just am very curious about how that may have played a role in whatever biological transformations occurred out of the oyster genus into other organisms.
Yeah, so there are several. So oysters belong to a broad family. So there's species, and then the next larger group is genus, and the next larger group is family. So there's the oyster family, the Ostreidae. Within it, there are a number of different genera, the plural for genus. So there's Ostrea, there's Crassostrea, there's Dendrostrea. There's a number of different things. Usually they end in Ostrea, which is either a Greek or Latin for oyster. And so there's a number of different ones. And so within the family of oysters, there's only oysters. They didn't evolve into something else. They're just all different kinds of oysters. And so to the extent that they evolve, they're probably, unless going to differentiate into other types of oysters. And as for the mechanisms that have led to what we call speciation, the differentiation into new types of species and eventually into new types of genera, that's a whole nother science, and one I'm not as well versed in as I am in the kinds of ecology and historical ecology type stuff that I've been talking about. And so there you want to go to an evolutionary biologist to make sure you get the right story about all of that. I know some of it, but I can't, but not enough for me to spot on the moment, give you a decent description of how that occurs. A lot of it has to do with separation, with species getting separated in some way, and then they're isolated from each other reproductively, and they can develop into new species. Sometimes they're in different habitats or different behaviors. They can essentially become separated so they don't reproduce with each other. They can reproduce at different times of the year, and that can also be a separation that allows them to then speciate. But there are yet other complicated factors to it, and habitat responses can be part of all that, such as the types of habitat responses you mentioned.
Thank you. You've certainly given me more than enough to chew on.
Well, I gave a little bit, but that's really the basics. And you want to go any further than that, that's as far as I dare go.
Well, I mean, throughout the entire program, Andy, I want to thank you. Janice, I see you there. Hi.
Hi. I wanted to know, like, you're talking about oyster and oyster farms. I'm thinking about San Francisco Bay, and I'm thinking about all the pollution that people are trying to remediate and do whatever with to clean it up. So where are these oyster farms, like when I go out and I order oysters, coming from? They're coming from farms that they're not grown in the bay or anything. They're grown somewhere that they're not going to kill me while I'm eating it.
That's right. Well, I'm not sure that oysters grown in San Francisco Bay would kill you. There are some parts of San Francisco which are very highly polluted, some smaller areas, the Richmond Ship Channel. There are certain areas that are known to be highly polluted sites. There are elevated pollutants in San Francisco Bay. It's not, I mean, I don't think it's correct to think of it as I'm necessarily going to get seriously ill from eating anything out of the bay. There are people who eat fish out of the bay regularly. There are warnings about eating too many of them and so on, and warnings for pregnant women and about how much to eat and so on. And those are cautionary. The bay has cleaned up a lot from what it was in the 1950s. There are still pollutants in it. They're still elevated relative to other cleaner sites along the West Coast, but it's not necessarily a terrible bay. I don't want people to think that they can't have contact with the bay, that it's dangerous to have contact. I think it's important for us to have a sense that it's a reasonable place. It still needs to be further cleaned up. We still need to continue to work on that. It's not at a point where anyone wants to develop a commercial oyster farm here, partly because of people's perception, partly because it's not as clean as other sites. So where the oysters are coming from, there are oyster farms in Tomales Bay. There used to be an oyster farm in Point Reyes Park in Drake's Estero, which was closed because the park wanted to restore the Estero to a place without a farm. That was very controversial, but there used to be an oyster farm up there. The biggest oyster farms are up in Washington State. There may be some still in Oregon. I believe there are some still in a couple of bays in Oregon. Willapa Bay has been traditionally a big oyster growing area up in Washington State. The southern part of Puget Sound has a number of major oyster growing areas. Hood Canal is still a major oyster growing area. Taylor Shellfish Farms has a number of sites up in Washington State. And if you go out and buy oysters, you'll often see that they have a label from Taylor Oyster Farms on them out in the market if you buy live oysters. So that's probably where most of them are coming from. Occasionally, they bring in oysters from other parts of the world. So you can get various types of Eastern oysters, either in restaurants or sometimes in the markets live, and they're shipped in from the East Coast. So you get your Blue Point oysters and various other specialty oysters, and you can pay quite a bit for them. And they're oysters just like the oysters here. Those would belong to the Virginia oyster species, Crassostrea virginica. The ones from this coast are either going to be, as I said, mostly or entirely the Pacific oyster, which is originally from Japan, or in smaller numbers, the native oyster is grown here as well, but not right in San Francisco Bay.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
I was thinking how wonderful it is that you were able to, when you and during your research, refer to such a wonderful collection of data about oysters, and it's such a huge body of work, particularly that one book you mentioned. I don't remember the author's name. Sorry, but just what an awesome world we live in where that was the case. And
Yeah. Yeah, that one book with all the pictures of oysters and all the pictures of all the bivalves of the world. It's really a remarkable piece of work by a guy who wasn't a professional scientist. He was a vastly interested person who became an expert from working at it and decided to take on this massive project. And then when he got done with it in 2010, he said, "All right, I'm done. I'm done with clams. I'm not doing that anymore." And he's off doing something else now. I wrote to him recently to ask him about this question, actually.
well, I know I can understand his excitement. I get so excited at these type of talks and listening to you. My idea is the Jack London Institute for the Study of Oysters.
Yeah.
In San Francisco Bay or California coast, if you will.
Well, someday there may be.
Well, certainly a lot of fascinating questions and mysteries still out there for people to look closely and to follow down the alleys to hopefully find like new places and new discoveries. So anyway, thank you so much. We have more questions. Otherwise, I think we may be at the time where we should say goodnight for tonight. And thank you so much for coming and spending so much time with us, Dr. Cohen. It was.
Of course, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you on one of these chats.
Are we going to do our clapping?
I don't miss one like I did before. I'm very sorry for that, but glad I was able to come back. So thank
totally
you
made up for it. Thank you.
Give a round of applause to Dr. Cohen and to everyone who came out tonight. To my dog, I'm going to mute.
Thank you very much. Good night, all.